Rob, first, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this. I'm so excited to have you here. So why don't you just start off by kind of giving us a little background about who you are, what you do, and what you would consider as your expertise.
So I'm several things. I'm both a staff member of IE University, IE Business School here in Madrid, one of the leading business schools here in Europe and part of the world, especially in the online world. I think one of the main things that we do great, because we've been doing it for a very long time, is online. So our blended global MBAs and so on have been around for quite a while. I work there and I have a sort of a dual department I'm an associate director of. One is executive education online. So again, the online world is very, very important for us. But the other thing that we do is called IE publishing. And you would think, oh, he publishes books. Nothing of the sort. Oh, he publishes research. That's not what we do either. There's a research department, there's an editorial department as well. What we do is we started especially with interactive online learning materials. We are also doing the written parts as well, but it's these kind of short things that you use typically in a session of class. That's one of the things. And in executive education online, we basically create the programs, the materials, the learning journeys that are, especially when it involves pre-recorded things. So it's not only about having a live session like we are having now that we're talking and we can be here for X amount of minutes. It's when we record, we edit, we take a lot of care in those videos or podcasts or text, and we create a journey out of that. And it might or might not include live sessions. So that's one of my roles. The other one is I teach the master's degree at the bachelor's. My formal area is operations and supply chain management. But of course, besides teaching operations and supply chain management, I also teach things around gamification. So I'm currently, in fact, yesterday I finished the class of the advanced seminar I have on gamification for bachelor students. It was very interesting. I have students from every single one of our bachelors. So that's a very interesting mix of people there. And of course, the other thing I see is this thing you see here which is called Professor Game. It is definitely, the main thing that I do there is the podcast, but it has led me to many opportunities. I've been doing workshops all around the world, speaking at conferences recently in GAMICON and Gamification Europe. I was talking to a Russian bank very recently as well. This has led to all sorts of exciting stuff, to meet very, very exciting people. And in the podcast, as you might or might not know, I interview the top world gamification experts and practitioners. 175 by now.
That's a lot.
Quite a few.
That's awesome. So, at our office, we kind of consider you like the guru because you get to talk to everyone. So you're like our go-to shop when we're looking for a pro. So I would love to just get a little bit of background on the science behind gamification. So one of our pet peeves is when people slap a leaderboard on something and claim it to be a gamification solution. So let's go kind of into the depth of gamification from your perspective. Give me that science behind it. Give me your big, massive explanation of gamification as a whole.
Quick story, because I know we always relate to stories as well. Given that I work at the university, I do Professor Game, I teach on gamification. Of course, when somebody comes in, if they know about me, we're a pretty large organization, but if somebody knows about me, they say, oh, somebody's talking about gamification, bring Rob into that meeting, whether it has to do with my job or not. And I'm happy to do so. I'm always happy to help, of course. But there was this one, I'm of course not going to name who the company was, saying, this was 5-6 years ago. And they said, oh, we've been researching and working on gamification for the past 20 years. And that's how they kicked off. It was there's something suspicious there. And you probably don't even know you're talking. There was other people as well who've been doing this in the room. It's you start off with a lie. That's a lie. Nobody's been doing this for 20 years formally, especially not researching gamification, because it didn't exist and people were not talking about it. It was not a thing, not only a trend, but not a thing for most people. So there's a lot of people out there, a lot of people giving us a bad name for gamification, game-based learning, applied games, serious games, whatever you want to call it. There are a lot of people giving us a bad name out there because beyond, not only not applying the science, they just want to slap things on and call it gamification because it is, or especially probably even was, a trend. That time when you looked at a LinkedIn and the word gamification expert showed up in, 80% of the profiles you looked at. That's when you say, well, I don't think 80% of the people I'm looking at are actual experts in gamification. That time is kind of going past. It's going to the past. And it seems like the people who are still in the space even if some might have started even with the points, badges, and leaderboards, they're starting to get into this a bit more. And of course, there's nothing wrong with using a leaderboard in itself. The question is, and that's why what I always encourage when I'm teaching, when I'm doing workshops, when I'm giving talks, it is not about whether you use or don't use points, badges, and leaderboards. It's about thinking, what do you want to get from those tools or any other tools that you're using? If gamification is what you want to do, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, why? You want gamification? Well, it's not a trend anymore, so don't tell me it's because everybody's using it. Why do you want to get into gamification? And I don't want to say the good answer, but the answer that typically leads into something that is interesting and that can be worked on is when people say, well, we have a problem of motivation. Our employees are supposed to see this training and they're definitely not going through because it's super boring. So you thought of gamification, fun and games, right? There's where you maybe help them a bit and guide them through the journey. But the typical thing that I might be saying is that, and there's where you can bring something, or there is this behavior in the company that we want to help tailor towards something, better, more productive, more positive, or there's a negative thing going on and we want to help change this. And there's always the ethical considerations that have to be taken into account, which are very, very important. So when you are thinking of motivation, there are many tools in the toolbox of gamification, of game design, all of these strategies that can be, pulled out of there to target your specific audience. So that's the next thing that you probably want to be thinking about. Why do you want to do it? What do you want to achieve? And who do you want to achieve it for? And that's basically where it starts taking off. And when you think these things through, basically, and it sounds like obvious, but it's not what you see very, very often. When you actually think things through and you design for what and who you are actually designing, the success rate, of course, goes up. And then you can do things like iteration, you can do prototyping, MVPs, all these things that are, sort of buzzwords in many, many different arenas to help us, guide the solution towards that final stage.
Awesome. And I'm kind of curious. So here we have kind of almost layers. So we have like our superficial levels of gamification, and then we have the deeper ones that maybe like when we're talking to a company, management is very aware of, but it's more of those subliminal gamifications that employees don't even necessarily realize they're interacting with an element of gamification. So we kind of like to tier them. If you had to kind of rate some of your favorite elements of gamification in like from superficial to really deep, I'd love to hear kind of how you rate those things.
Typically, what people talk about, and I remember very much my friend Roman Rakwitz he's from Germany. He's very much of a leading gamification designer in Germany. He always he has a very strong perspective on this, right? So he says, when it's just extrinsic, motivation, extrinsic rewards, that's bad gamification. He is a bit too much for my liking. He's my friend. We're actually going to have a conversation soon about this. So there is the extrinsic rewards or motivation. There's like different ways of seeing it, but there's that layer which typically tends to tailor towards the short term, right? So you want people to get to do something like right now. For example, one of the things that we do is when we are creating our materials at IE Publishing, we create things that are for a session. So you don't have to think of that long perspective. Like, when they think about this in a year's time, how are they going to No, we're not thinking about that. We're intentionally not thinking about that. We're actually getting them to take the next step. So sometimes using some extrinsic rewards that get you a quick result can be actually the right thing to do. And that's why, well, that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why I've seen, extrinsic things and extrinsic rewards can actually work. They can be that, what some people might call a bit superficial, but they might work for what you need. And again, it depends on very much on what you are looking for. And it has to do, I talk a lot about the long run and the short run. We do a lot for the short run, a lot. Like, again, the materials we create are for a session. So how do you keep the people's attention in that session? You can be flashy, that's fine. I mean, having, news coming up, having a story that is very, very flashy, something that relates very much to them, putting them on a leaderboard if you have very competitive students, which our business students tend to be. Those are things that can go very, very well. if, again, they're tailored for that. And then there is what people like to talk about is the intrinsic motivation. So you're designing for people, maybe you put some extrinsic, or like Yukai Chao likes to say, you use some black hat, to get the people in and do the first actions, the first things. But if you want to keep them there, you don't want them to burn out, because eventually, just like in a game, right? I don't know if you're a fan of Candy Crush, but people who like Candy Crush very much, they liked it for some time, but eventually they stuck it out, like they were stuck to Candy Crush, and then said, oh my goodness, I'm off Candy Crush. That addiction is finally gone. You don't want people, even if they spend a year and a half, 2 years with your solution, you don't want them to have that feeling, right? Especially in the, in the professional environment, you don't want people to feel that their company is sort of tricking them or anything. Mm-hmm. So you might want to go for something that is more intrinsic, something that they might enjoy or not suck so much, because sometimes training can suck. That is something that happens. We just want to unsuck a little bit out of that. Anjay likes to mention that way of seeing things, because it's not always going to be like super fun and everybody screaming and clapping around the room. Sometimes it is just about making it more, a bit more interesting for people to actually take that action, for example, in a training. You think about that intrinsic motivation, things about like creativity, like the social interactions. There's different ways of seeing this. Again, Yukai talks about white hat and black hat, and separates as well, like extrinsic and intrinsic. Anjay likes to talk about the ramp, relatedness, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So those are the intrinsic ones, especially. So there's like many different theories that go around this, but the bottom line here is you're not getting, the motivation doesn't come from receiving something that is external to you, but rather from something you are intrinsically interested in.
And I'm very curious to know, do you think it is possible to have a holistic approach to gamification in one specific project? And there's so many directions you can go, and there are so many elements. Do you think it's possible to make one gamification solution that's going to cover them all, or do you think it has to be very tailored to the situation?
What do you mean cover them all? That's my first question to help clarify.
Like what I'm kind of picturing is, so say one of our clients came to us and they have a million problems and they love gamification and they want every element that they've ever read about gamification to solve all their problems. Do you think it's possible for us to give them all of those, or do you think it would be impossible no matter how hard we try?
Okay, so that is an interesting one. The thing is, what gamification needs to build on, typically, the first thing that you need is a way to provide people feedback, right? So something where you do something and that something sort of talks back to you in some way, shape, or form. And that can be a board game when you do an action, that means you move the piece from one place. That is a piece of feedback, right? Or it tells you, oh, the next action you have to do is pick up a card and read this. So there has to be that feedback mechanism there. Whether it is possible or not, I'm not sure that's necessarily the most interesting possibility. It's whether it's desirable or not. So let's get into specific things. For example, it's not the same for you to help your company get people to do the whatever mandatory training people have to do. Like, for example, this was a completely different thing that we did at my job. We were creating an online learning tool for people that had to do a training for the new laws on finance and in banks, and they had to learn all these things. So one thing is to help them go through that journey of mandatory training, which is completely different, and there's not necessarily a good reason to put it inside the same box of, maybe a gamification that you have for your sales team, right? So you're getting them, for example, a sales team might be very, very competitive. That's the typical thing that we think. Let's assume that is actually real. And they are, having their leaderboard, they're having, their weekly achievements. That system there does not necessarily have to do anything to do, because how do you compare the stars you earn in one and the other? Do they get you the same types of things? Are both leading to, like, doing the mandatory training leads maybe to a promotion in the future, the same way being the best salesman in your company? Like, I'm not sure you want to mix them together. I'm not sure. Again, this is sort of the first thoughts I get on this. Being possible, I'm sure it's possible. Like, if you consider, for example, if you say, well, the system is the web page of the intranet of the company. Well, everything falls into the intranet. You can put anything and everything into the intranet and consider that the single solution if what you want is to say you have the same thing, but I'm not sure they should be necessarily mixed together.
Yeah, that was a good answer. We get, clients who want like everything to be awesome. So I was just kind of curious what your thoughts were on that, because we have a hard time making that happen sometimes.
And even go further, like what if part of what you want to do with gamification is engage your customers? How do you mix your customers and your employees? Does that data mix? Can the customers see how your employees are doing? Like, is there a leaderboard there where
it's really muddy when they're competing with the employees, right? That doesn't make sense.
That's what I mean. Like, is that what you want, really? I would argue typically you don't. There might be some fringe cases, but typically I don't think that is the best way to approach it.
Yeah, so switching gears just a little bit here, I want to hear a bit about your experience working. I know that you're a professor, so working with younger generations. So a big portion of the workforce that we serve are those younger generations. So of course we always hear things about Gen Z and millennial, and also you being in Spain. I'm curious to hear if things are the same there, but at least here in the US, there's a lot of attitude about younger generations, right? We want to automatically make assumptions. You hear all kinds of things about them being distracted and not really being into work. First, I'm curious to hear, in your role as a professor, are you seeing that to actually be true when you're working with our future workforces?
So there's definitely differences in generations. And let me go to something a lot more basic. For example, I studied at the university. I started in 2003, right? So when I was studying engineering, right? So I looked at the tests that we used the previous test to study. So I started with the tests for whatever reason, like from 1963. They were super, like we spent like several days in the library solving those tests together among many people, having the answers, having access to the books, right? Then we started moving, of course, for whatever reason, we started on those and we started moving forward. By the time we reached the tests in 99, we could solve, not only because we had more practice, but because the tests were actually easier. Right? And this is something that is happening for many reasons. Like, for example, people argue that at my university, we shouldn't be doing engineering without a calculator. We were doing actually the manual calculations. Of course, the calculations themselves were not as complex as you do with the calculator, but people said like, you shouldn't even be doing that because it doesn't make any sense anymore. So there you're seeing a level of complexity in what is you're doing that is changing. And that makes sense. I mean, because the world is changing, the way you do these calculations in the real world is changing. Hence, what you do in the university is probably need to change as well. You should be reflecting what happens in the outside world. You should be thinking about what these students are going to be doing in the real world, right? So that is the first clarification. I think it is very, very important to have that in mind. There are changes and things are going to be different. And there's even new careers. There all sorts of things can be different. Then about the attention spans and so on. It is true that, I think I should be baby boomers, generation X, generation Y, right? So the millennials. So I'm supposed to be a millennial, right? So we millennials, right? We were born with all this interaction, generation Z even more. The thing is, there are commonalities here that you could say, oh, everybody is like this. And it's not really true. I mean, if you go to the population of a rural area in Africa, they might have something in common as far as sort of the generation like to maybe, baby boomers, because maybe the technology in that rural area is more similar to what you had back in those times, right? So that generation aspect is a broad generalization, and as most of those, they tend to be not completely correct. So that is one thing, right? The other thing is, of course, that not only are these new generations, like you say, well, you say, oh, when I was studying at the university, this and that happened. Of course, if you were studying in the university, like you are, 55 years old, if you came back to the university nowadays, you would be doing exactly the same things as I am, and you would be, sort of target to the same distractions as I am. So there, our generations would probably sort of merge a little bit more together in the sense that you also have, a mobile phone that has apps and has games, and you probably even are playing some of those games as well, even if, baby boomers like to say they hate games or whatever, right? That is not true. That is not true. So not true. They like sports, like maybe it's different types of games. And there is, when it is very important, as I said before, you start by that why, that objective, understanding really what you want to achieve. But then you also have to go through thinking, what are you designing and who you are designing it for. Again, those differences could be geographical. Those differences could be in motivations. Those differences could be in objectives. It could be in player profiles. It could be in psychological profiles. There's many ways to classify people for the solutions you're creating. And if you're targeting a generation, we'll study it from the perspective of generations, but also who are the people, the types of people within the generation that you're targeting. Because it's not the same to say, I'm a computer engineer, right? So I'm a profile, but I'm going to be a very different profile. Even back in the day when I was studying that, somebody was studying architecture, for example, more artsy, more manual labor, more kinds of things to do with their hands probably. And again, this is a generalization, of course, but you would probably be seeing different things from different profiles. And there is where I think the focus needs to be placed.
I like that a lot. And I like kind of viewing it from that external, what are we all interacting with daily, which has changed rather than when we were born. I really like that approach to it. And so this is always a big question. People always hate me when I ask this one. So we'll start big and then we'll narrow it down. But especially looking at it from your perspective, so seeing what the future of work is as you're working, especially with these business students who are going to go out there and run the world one day. What do you think needs to happen for the workforce to keep up? We know that especially people entering the workforce today, they expect a lot different things from the companies they work for as far as accountability, as far as social conscience. What do you think the corporate or business world needs to do to keep up with those expectations? What do you think needs to happen for them to stay relevant with new employees?
I think that the main thing is like the world is changing so fast that we are like never really prepared for what's coming next. So basically, I think that the companies need to understand, and this also has to do with universities, is the profile that you're looking for, the types of people, and what you're preparing those people for is different than, in the early 1900s, for sure. Why? Because in the early 1900s, you knew you're teaching them to do this specialized, very specialized job, and if they did it very, very well, you were doing better. Thing is, nowadays, those very, very super hyper specialized jobs that were sort of everlasting. You could spend 20, 30, 40 years of your life doing exactly the same thing. And if you're fine with that, you would be there. Most people as well were fine with that. Nowadays, and that could have a little bit more of a generational component, people don't remain so long in jobs. Even the ones who do are sort of switching in roles and going, you're expecting, many people are expecting to sort of climb the corporate ladder, or at least horizontally do different things to keep it interesting, right? So that ability to switch gears from one thing to the other, I'm not saying, a person who knows about absolutely everything, but who is actually able to do that switching of gears faster. How do you do that switching of gears faster? How can you learn faster? How can you be prepared for constantly learning? And there is as well, or I think, both people who are in corporate training and universities very much come in, because it's not just about that title you receive as a bachelor, engineer, whatever. Then what comes next? You start in a role and then you need to prepare for something else. So how does a company, again, either through their own corporate academy or relating to universities, which is something that we do a lot as well, how do you keep that workforce current? And not only current, but changing. Today it's data, tomorrow it's this. It's going to be constantly changing. Designing for behavioral science and gamification and these things, this is something that you probably need to consider now that maybe in the past it was sort of more clear-cut, the things that you had to do or had to do, or we thought it was more clear-cut because we weren't considering all of the implications and complexities. So I think that element of being able to change faster is very, very important.
Definitely. And you mentioned it a little bit, but I'd love for you to go a little more in depth on how do you picture gamification being a part of that, or how do you think it should be a part of that? Do you see it definitely happening? Do you think there's still more changes that need to be done to get it involved? What do you think?
Oh, a lot. There's a lot. We've been I would say that the industry has been dreaming about where it can be for maybe 10 years. And some people are disappointed that it's already been, 10 years, 5 years, whatever you perceive it has been, and nothing has changed. Well, first of all, many things have changed. But second, 10 years is not that much time. There's corporate structures that take a long time to change. Like I was talking to a fellow colleague recently, and he was saying, when I came to this, I was thinking, 2020, it's going to be, everything's going to be gamified and we're going to be playing all around and everybody's going to be enjoying their jobs and having fun. Well, hold on, maybe, but the chances are that things are going to move a lot slower. And I'm not going to say that's okay, because you probably think it's not, but that's the way the world is. So how can we, within the boundaries and the restrictions, unless you're sort of revolutionizing something and think that it's going to completely change, but how within those boundaries can we move forward and make those changes that I do think are necessary? And gamification, and especially the experiential aspect of gamification, that aspect of actually doing the things and not only talking about the things. Think of, and I know this is already starting to happen in many places, instead of talking about how good you are at teamwork at an interview, you are dropped into a simulation or a game where they see how you fare. And again, there's not necessarily a good or bad answer to what you're doing. It's just a difference in profiles. Maybe you're not the right profile for that company because your culture is better adjusted to company, where you're going for company A and it's company B. If if you get those results, or you're able to provide a bit more of transparency to your participants, which is something that is always very desirable, it's not always possible, they might say, oh, maybe they rejected me, or I didn't fit into this company, not because I'm a bad employee, because that's very self-defeating as well, but because I don't fit into this company. But maybe I take a look, and it goes both ways, right? It's not only about the company saying you don't fit in, but it's you saying, well, I actually do think I fit in this other company. And you making that new sort of interview process that hopefully can be a lot more gamified, and they're being actually able to experience that and show what you're able to do. And that is where I think there is still a long way to go, especially in the learning space. It's not just about dumping content, which is still something that we see a lot. It's not only about how to get the content through, but what you're able to do with that. And that's where I kind of have, not arguments, but the typical thing of my colleagues is, what are, the midterm and the final test? Where in the world are they ever going to be able to apply what they memorized for those two things? When? How? I'm still waiting for a satisfactory answer. People say things like, oh, and one of them I perfectly understand. Like, it's one of the best proxies to understanding what they have learned that we have currently. But that means we're not still willing to go an extra mile and see what else is out there, right? Asking them to do, and that's what I love to do. I love to get them to do sort of a consultancy project and see, oh, fictitious or real company, get into a project, do something, show me what you're able to do, and go as far as possible. Sometimes, for example, in gamification, it's not possible to get to a decent prototype because we don't have enough time, right? And maybe they don't have the resources. It might require investment, or it might require a company who sponsors them. But get them to get to a basic wireframe of what that looks like. And if you have somebody who really knows about this, or bring in a jury from experts in gamification, so they see what they're able to do and actually do things. I can assure you that even just by doing that shift, students will be more interested in doing that. And hence, if people are more interested, they'll be learning a lot more. And they'll be able to apply those things when they go out there. I think that is a very important shift. Again, both in formal education and corporate learning, that I think is still to happen and is very necessary. We need to realize that, the 17th century tests that we still conduct now on a computer, of course, we've advanced in technology. Those are things that we need to move away from. They're not desirable. They're not useful. I mean, maybe they're useful for when you're learning how to add. It's really simple to just put things and put people to add and show the results. But when you're entering the workforce, when you're entering a university where you're expected to graduate and be able to do something, I mean, it's a lot more difficult to be able to do that, right? And writing your thesis is very interesting and very useful in many ways. But if you're going to work in a corporation, how does your thesis actually get applied? It has many interesting insights and things that you can use, but how do you apply? Now, how do we teach people what their work is going to do, and how to apply all that learning into that? It's super difficult. I'm not saying there's no difficulties in there, but I do think there is a wide open opportunity for that to progress.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So that's going to bring me to my final question, and I'm going to change this one a little bit. So normally I like to ask just what do you think the future of work is, but I love your last answer, so I want to kind of build that in here. So can you explain to me the future of work in your dream world if gamification was working the way you think it should on a large scale? I want to hear what that would look like to you.
Sure. So one of the things I there is an example, and this is actually happening today, and very very low technology in that sense. It doesn't require huge things. This is a company in India. I was writing a case, and I have failed to complete that that assignment on my own. But they are doing something very interesting. They were saying, look, having a review every 6 months with your employee and telling them what they did right and wrong, it's a flawed process. Essentially, I mean, that doesn't really work. What do games do great? They give you instant feedback, right? You click, to the left and it moves to the left. If there's a pit, you're going to fall into the pit, right? But there's two things. One, you'll get to recover and get back out of the pit, but you get that feedback. You're able to do it differently. You're seeing what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. Maybe you have to go into a bit of analysis, but you see that happening right there. So they implemented this system. Again, I think it's only Excel sheets, so it's relatively very basic, in which they sit down with it's kind of salespeople. They do it over the phone, and they have their objectives per week. And they sit down together every week with their team leader, and there's a whole structure and so on, and say, well, this week, what you have to achieve is getting these 7 clients. I think it's headhunters. So you have to achieve to get, 5 new executives for your clients this week. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, 5 makes sense, but I only have 5 clients. So that means I have to achieve 100%. Maybe this week, because they're difficult profiles, let's take it to 4. Okay, let's agree. You have 4, your objectives are getting to 4 clients. So for every client you get sort of a star or something. But those stars are not just, you did it right, good for you. Those are the stars that you're actually accumulating to get, your salary raises, to become a team leader eventually. They're very directly tied to your performance. And of course, this has to be designed very, very carefully, because, if you're just sort of pushing people to productivity, you burn them out as well. But doing exactly the same thing that you might be doing every day, you're getting instant feedback on how well you are doing or not. So that, and it doesn't look like a game. It's not like they do that and they see a Mario figure jumping around, right? It is a very subtle way of applying gamification, or very, in your face. I'm not sure. I haven't sat down with them and seen the system. They showed me some of their Excels, but I haven't sat with an external employee and see what it looks like. But whether it's in your face, game-like, or it is very, very subtle, the way of approaching this and giving instant feedback to people on how they are faring and allowing them to make the small mistakes in that system so that they don't commit it outside, I think that is a huge part of what the workforce should be like. Same as what I was talking before, the interviews. Why, instead of me talking to you and saying how awesome I am, and you believing me or not believing me, because my ear twitched a little bit when I was saying that, instead of having that, and there's a lot of science behind that, don't get me wrong, but there is a lot better way to not only see what people say in an interview, whether they say it right, they say it wrong, their eyebrow goes up or down. There are many more things that we can see by people actually doing things, right? And I'm not saying, oh, you're going to hire a designer, get them to do a design that you needed for a project and don't pay them. You hire 10 designers, you get 10 projects, and you just hire one. That's cheating on people, and this is something I've seen. That's why I'm mentioning this kind of example.
No, that's not good.
It's horrible. But get them to do an exercise. Get them to do something, because you won't know. I mean, hiring and firing somebody is super expensive for both parties, for the hiring party and for the hire. If you're hired and after 3 months you're fired, you lost 3 months of your life. Yeah, you had a salary for 3 months. But the effort of getting a new job, stopping from that, you maybe rejected some other opportunities you had in the process. It is a very costly thing. So trying to get that right is all about your actual ability to conduct and do things. And that definitely extends to learning. What do you learn? How do you learn it? And how do you apply that in real life situations? And again, it takes a lot of effort. It probably takes a lot of money as well. But I do think that it also leads to much better results.
Yeah, I could definitely see why that would help. So just to wrap up here, I want to give you a minute to brag a little bit, share. I know that you touched on some of the work you're doing, but share with us kind of where people can follow up with you, where they can learn more about you, listen to more of your theories and ideas, and get even more inspired.
Sure. So the best way is always, through Professor Game. You go to professorgame.com, and there you'll see there's a little thing on the right where you can subscribe to the email list, which I have to, get more active, definitely. any opportunities that come up, anything that I do is definitely going to be announced there. If I create courses, if there's anything sort of open to the public, I had a sort of a course for students within the same university, so that's not something I'm going to announce there. But anything that is in the open, I announce it there. There you can, of course, you can see any of the episodes. As I mentioned before, 175 episodes. Like, there's many more people out there that I still have to interview for sure, and that gets me excited and gets me up every day to continue working on the podcast. But there is a lot that you can get from that. If you want to get inspiration, if you want to hear from different people, I mean, you can literally spend half a year listening to this podcast every day, and you'll still have a little bit more material to go through. So hopefully, you don't just do it every day. You also mix it up with other interesting things you want to do, and continue to listen to that. Again, just even to draw the inspiration. You hear people, what they do, what they've been doing, and how that can be applying to your specific case. And of course, if you want more interaction in the email list, you can always reply to me. I read every email, reply to every single one I can, but I read everything that is sent to me for sure.